I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And I started reading Lucy Sante's work. Oh, I don't even remember when Low Life came out. I was a baby bookseller, so I think I just dated myself.
91.
Okay, 91. So the new book, your latest book, is called I Heard Her Call My Name, and it is beautiful. This book is gorgeous, and I love your sentences all over again. It's a little different. It's a little more personal. I mean, and I say this having read Factory of Facts, where you open with like 19 different versions of how your life could have started in Belgium. But I am going to ask you how it feels to have this book out in the world.
Oh, I mean, I've been on pins and needles for 11 months now, which is how long it's been since I turned in the manuscript. And I am consumed by the wish to explain myself to every single person in the world. And this is the handy one stop. So I just want everybody to read it so I don't have to stand in the supermarket aisle and declare everything that there is to declare.
But also, you're still evolving. You make it really clear that transition is a process. And this sort of alignment of inner and outer, like you're still figuring it out too. And you're very honest about some stuff that maybe you would have thought about differently. And as I was reading I Heard Her Call My Name, I kept thinking about this piece that you had written in the New York Review of Books about collage and your love of collage. And you're also a very analog kind of gal. And you have a love of the analog, right? Like collage is part of your thing. Music has always been part of your thing. I mean, you even say it in the new memoir that you're profoundly nostalgic for the analog era. And I overlap with you in that analog era. But it was a piece of technology. It was an app, a photo app that sort of sets off the new book. And can I ask you to tell a little bit of that story? Because I was like, really, an app? An app, Lucy?
Well, the fact is, I figured out just recently, like within the past few weeks, I finally figured out the mechanics of the process. So I had known about FaceApp, and I had an old phone. It wasn't really working with that. I got a new phone, and a few months into ownership, I thought, oh, right, FaceApp. Why didn't I try that again? So I tried it again. And this time it returned this portrait of a woman who was recognizably me. And a shudder ran through me from the top of my skull to soles of my feet. And very soon, like within a day, I thought, wouldn't it be great to see what I would have looked like in my parallel life earlier?
Right.
So I started hunting down every photo between the ages of like 10 and up to the present, and that became a treasure hunt. There aren't huge numbers of photos of me. I was very camera shy. Became this treasure hunt that covered my whole house, basement to attic. I was going through boxes and shopping bags and biscuit tins, and what that did was it broke the self-imposed time restriction that I placed on any transgender mental investigation I'd done before that. And that's what caused the dam to burst. It was able to get past that time restriction. Suddenly I was in free fall, it was crazy. It just happened sort of instantaneously, really. I stopped being able to lie to myself. I realized this is the truth about me, and it has been the truth historically forever. So I had no choice but to come out to my shrink, to my partner, to my son, and to my friends, and snowballed from there.
Some of those photos are in this book, in the finished book, and I love them. They're beautiful. And
it's remarkable. Yeah.
You look happy. I mean, there's this kind of famous photo of you that ran in, the Paris Review and a bunch of other places. And I think it's an old headshot from the 70s, and it just kept, you had quite long hair and a snarl.
It's a photo booth picture, and I'm wearing
that's what it is. Okay. Right. And everyone has seen this photo, but it's very sort of tough and,
right,
edgy. And you look so relaxed in these photos, and just sort of
that
like,
struck me too.
Right. And I'm so happy they're there. I mean, I'm used to reading your work in the New York Review of Books too, and I've read your books. And you have a very distinct voice on the page. And one of the things you're wrestling with as you go through the story you're telling us is that you were always thinking about what would happen to my identity as a writer. I mean, I'm a writer first. What happens? What happens when my byline changes? What happens to who I am intrinsically? And yet, I mean, I have a measure to compare that. Yes, it's been a minute since I've read Low Life, but I mean, I know when I'm reading you. And it was wild to me going through this new book and hearing you say, well, I was never comfortable in my own skin, or I knew I had to lock myself down and protect myself because I just couldn't handle who I am. And here you are sort of saying, okay, now I have this physical evidence. I have these photographs that sort of switch it. You kept going, and the timeline was surprising to me. I mean, you sort of went from 0 to 60 because it had been 60 years.
Yeah.
And I'm one of the people who had no idea. I mean, obviously I'm meeting you now for the first time, but obviously I've been experiencing your work for, well, since 1991.
Well, I mean, nobody in my life had any idea. Nobody. I did not come out to anyone. The only person I ever started coming out to was a great psychotherapist I had in the 80s who just dropped dead one day, 20 minutes after I left his office. So that froze that impulse.
But you've opened Pandora's box, as you call it. You sent an email to friends and family, and Pandora's box is open. And yet, it seems like you really did need the tech, because also you're talking about how the internet allowed you to sort of see all of the different varieties of transgender life. For the longest time, you thought you were the only person who felt this way, that you had been assigned the wrong gender. And, obviously the world has showed us that that is just not the case. And I'm sure it has not been the case since long before the internet.
Well, I found out about, Christine Jorgensen, maybe after I considered my transness, not really knowing what it was, for a good 3 or 4 years. And that was when I first learned that there were others. Yeah, the internet also, I mean, just crucially, I mean, this is how ignorant I am. I didn't know about hormones. I didn't know what they did, I thought, being transsexual is a matter of going to Casablanca and having that operation, I mean, basically it,
And yet here you are challenging yourself. I mean, there are plenty of folks who've come out much younger than you. There are people who've also come out in midlife, but you were what, 66, 67?
I was 66.
Did you ever think you were going to get to this point? I mean, you really, from reading the book, it sounds like you were so locked down that this was just not, and then boom.
I kind of did it as a thought experiment in my head a couple of times. And because I know that I gave myself a lecture one day, I don't know how many years ago this was, but like 10, 15, 20 years ago, I remember thinking, well, your work is never going to be first rate unless you acknowledge the central contradiction, basically. You can write all the books you want, they're going to be very pretty, but if they don't tell the truth comprehensively, it's just not worth the effort, maybe. It becomes decorative art rather than real art. So I remember having that thought, but being too chicken to pursue it.
One of the things that I sort of kept wrestling with as I was reading is how lonely it must have been for you. I mean, even with your friends and your family, you were just in a place that it had to have been slightly crippling to be that lonely.
I didn't have any friends or even any peers for big stretches of my youth. I was alone. I was really alone. Like multiply alone, because I was with these immigrant parents who didn't have a social life and didn't go out into the world. It just completely perverted me in a certain kind of way. And certainly I was alone with much more than just my trans identity. I mean, it was years and years before I found people I could talk to about books I was reading,
Hmm.
matters of the imagination, all this kind of stuff. And the fact is that, well, here I am, I'm alone again, and I've been living in a town for 16 years, and I know maybe five people in this town.
Would you come back to New York? It's been a minute since you've lived in New York.
Yeah, it's been 24 years. I keep thinking about this. I mean, New York is just not the same place I lived in. It's become a completely different city. On the other hand, there will come a time as I advance into old age where I won't feel so comfortable with stairs and driving. And I've
Yeah.
always wanted to live in a residential hotel, like the old kind with the bar restaurant downstairs. But I don't know, New York or some European city, maybe, because I still, I'm dual citizen. I don't know. We'll see.
Oh, I didn't realize you still had your Belgian citizenship. I
Mhm,
mean, it was a little complicated, your parents moving over. You've said in the past that you felt like you'd moved 4 times to the United States. And
mhm.
once your dad came for a job that didn't happen, and then you had to go back, and your grandparents were kind of complicated and whatnot. But
Yeah.
I think I forgot you grew up in New Jersey. I think I always thought of you as like a New Yorker, and I
Yeah.
didn't realize there was all that time in New Jersey. No disrespect to New Jersey. I'm not making, it's just, I didn't think of you as a suburban kid. I think I've just sort of thought that you organically showed up on the Lower East Side.
I used to jokingly say that I moved to the Belgium of the United States from the New Jersey of Europe.
Oh, okay. Because I've never been to Belgium, so I had
Uh,
no
well, it's
idea.
kind of similar, small annex to the
Okay.
big show.
But maybe not everyone knows this too, that you got a free ride to Columbia. But because of your background, your parents had never sort of explained to you what you do after college, right? So here you are, you have, well, almost got a fancy degree, didn't quite finish the fancy degree, but you were running around with like Jim Jarmusch and Jean Michel Basquiat and Nan Golden shortly after this experience. But you also kind of needed to figure out what was going on work wise.
Yeah.
And so you were a bookseller, like many of us start out while we're figuring out what's going on. You were a bookseller, you were writing a zine, you end up working for Barbara Epstein at the New York Review of Books, which leads you to reviewing. But you never sort of had the straight shot at becoming the writer and critic that you have become. I mean, it wasn't a clear line, was it?
Well, I mean, okay, when I was 18, I did have to make the choice between writing and visual art, and
Okay.
getting a scholarship to Columbia solved that one. So
Okay.
I wanted to, decide to be a writer.
Hmm.
What kind of a writer? Well, I was a poet when I was a teenager, then realized that really I didn't think in chopped lines. I thought in prose. So I was really a prose writer. What kind of prose writer? I had no idea of what kind of writing I would do. I always thought I'd be a novelist, but I don't really think in terms of story.
Right.
My Achilles heel, maybe. Well, it was definitely a consequence of working at the New York Review and beginning to write for them when I was
Hmm.
27 that informed me of, I mean, there's a way in which Low Life was kind of a direct transmission from, say, Patriotic Gore by Edmund Wilson,
Yeah.
which is like one of the cornerstone works of the New York Review
Hmm.
historically.
Every time I go to clean out my bookcases to donate, I can't get rid of my New York Review of Books classics. That whole line,
Yeah,
it just the
yeah, yeah.
spines keep increasing, and I can't. And I can promise you, I did not need a second copy of Flaubert and Bovary, the Francis Stevenmuller.
Right.
But the copy I had used to belong to my dad, and the paper was getting funky, and it just smelled really bad. I was like, you know what? I actually kind of want to read a little bit of this again, and I need a copy that just doesn't smell terrible, which is
Yeah.
ridiculous, but there you have it. But I went back and I read your Elvis review. That was the
Uh,
first thing and it makes perfect sense to me that you did this review because obviously music has always been a big part. You've written about Patti Smith in the past and but this Elvis review, can we talk about this for a second? Do you even remember like I mean, it was 1981. I know I'm asking you about a review from 1,000 years
no,
ago,
no.
but it sounds like it's still pretty fresh for you because you were like, "Oh, this is what I want to do." Can we just talk about that evolution for a second?
Well, in that case, it was partly about I was not a big Elvis fan, but of course, all respect. But it galled me to, I mean, it's when I first started thinking really about the lie detector properties of prose. I mean, the way you can read character into prose. I was reading this text by Albert Goldman, and it was just a succession of red flags going up, one
Mm-hmm.
after the other. He was not telling the truth about any of it, pretty much. The tissue of lies. So that's, I had my job cut out for me.
Part of why I set us up with talking about that review a little bit too, and having you talk about sort of the tissue of lies and this lie detector property of writing is here you are doing this work and you're interrogating art and you're interrogating narratives that people are setting up for us. And yet, I mean, you even call yourself out in I Heard Her Call My Name, where you say, well, I'm being a bit of a hypocrite because here I am, trying to tell the truth about other people and I can't even do it for myself and I'm not even holding up my own ethics.
Bingo.
It was wild to me reading that. I mean, here you're really leaving everything. Pardon the bad sports metaphor for 2 seconds, but it is kind of the best one I have. You're leaving everything on the field in this book, Lucy. I mean, you're sharing all of the stuff that is challenging to you, but especially because your primary identity is as a writer who wants to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
That's the piece that I kept coming back to. I mean, beautiful sentences aside, and, things that you share a lot, and I appreciate all of it, but at the same time, I was like, wow. All of that time, all of those days and weeks and months and years that you didn't want to talk about it. You're here now.
Yeah.
You're here now. I mean, it's got to be a little bit of a relief. Yeah, I mean, I understand that it's got to be scary and intimidating, but there has to be some relief that comes with saying,
well, no, I mean, it's not scary or intimidating,
okay,
really.
okay,
It's actually a huge relief,
okay.
and I feel good. I like myself most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, it is very lonely because I know so few trans people.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, the ones I know, with a few exceptions, the ones I know are 40 years younger than I am. And so
Yeah.
it's a world I can't really penetrate. I'm forever doomed to be a satellite. When people have these attacks of imposter syndrome
Right.
vis-a-vis gender, when trans people have that,
Okay.
they call it dysphoria. I mean, gender dysphoria is the umbrella term, but attack of dysphoria. And well, I just spent yesterday having one all day long. It's tough, but at the same time, there's this bedrock sense that what am I going to do at this point? Go back to being a man? That's not going to work. It didn't really work the first time, in fact. I mean, I found myself, especially early on in my transition, I was thinking, as fearing for my love life ever after, I was really kind of wishing that I were transitioning the opposite direction. I was really becoming a guy, which I'd never really been, because at least that way I could attract a woman, I mean, it's crazy because my relationship of 14 years,
Right.
I mean, we're still very, very close, but the romantic part of it was the casualty of all this.
But you do talk about the 24-year-old who, wait, am I saying this right? She's your trans mother in a way?
Yeah, well, that's kind of our joke.
Oh,
But
sorry. Okay. Sorry.
no, but I mean, in the sense that, like, for example, in the houses, the ballroom
Yeah, yeah.
houses, there's always a mother,
Okay. Okay.
and so it's kind of my conceit that, but it's actually true though. That's the crazy thing is I learned so much from
Mm-hmm.
her, from Leor. She taught me so much and gave me courage. She was a trans woman who I could not, absolutely not think of as a freak. And the fact that, walking with her on the street, for example, it was contagious. It was a remarkable gift. And I'm not sure I would have survived my first
Mm-hmm.
year without her.
But I also love the idea that you at 66 could look to a then 24-year-old
Yeah.
and say, hey, wait a minute, I haven't got the first clue. I think there are so many narratives that come up, certainly with gender identity, but also, race and sexuality. There's so many things. And it's just the idea that you can have this exchange of ideas with someone who is 2/3 your age. Sorry to do the math.
You know what it reminded me of?
What?
I worked in factories when I was a teenager. I worked in two factories. One of the standard rules of operation in the factory was that the last hire teaches the new hire because the lessons are fresh in their mind. The old people have internalized everything so much they couldn't begin to explain it. So that was kind of the principle there too.
I like that though. It crosses class, it
Yeah.
crosses gender, it crosses. I mean, you're having to make a new community, right? Writers are always going to be your primary tribe, without a
Yeah.
doubt.
Hmm.
But at the same time, here you are trying to balance these very primary identities, right? And you even say it in the book. You're like, this has always been the question: who am I?
Yeah.
Who am I? And so to see you sort of working it out on the page, and also as a person with a long torso, yes, like there is stuff we cannot wear. Okay, straight. I'm glad you discovered that early because there is some stuff I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa, that is. I'm all torso and have very short legs for my height. So it's you learn
Yeah.
very, very, very quickly.
I know. My lessons come every day.
Yeah, but you're doing it sort of really in the open. And I mean, there was the piece in Vanity Fair, which I think is excerpted from this book, or did it come in the reverse? You wrote the
No,
piece
no,
first
it's
and then
I
you
wrote that.
expanded.
I wrote that when I'd been transitioning for less than 6 months, and it was based on the letter that I sent out to people right away, my friends, and which I quote in full
Oh
in
yeah.
this book. Yeah.
I do love that letter though, and I think it's a great way to open the memoir. I didn't know if you were going to make us wait because I mean, obviously it's a deeply personal thing, so I didn't know where it was going to come and then I start reading and I'm like, "Oh, okay. We're here. Hello." But there was a second letter that you decided not to send. We're with you the entire time as you were working out a lot of very personal thinking early on, and where you
Mhm.
suddenly say, "Oh no, well, I can't go back to being a man, but now I'm not sure." And yet it seems like that was just you sort of snapping your head for a second because you really did know and you really thought, we set limits in ways that maybe people are not designed to have limits, and we can
Mm.
see you wrestling through this
Yeah.
on the page. So can we talk about the physical writing? I mean, obviously there's this great Vanity Fair piece, which
Mhm.
I'm really fond. The voice in that is great. And that voice carries through obviously the book, but you've got this essay, you've got the letter that you've written, you've got the second letter. But also you were not a big keeper of diaries or journals because also when you were young your mom would go through everything, which I'm so sorry. But how do you construct this narrative?
Well, I realized right away that the whole book couldn't just be about my transition. I'd already written that piece for one thing. Furthermore, I needed to contextualize my transition. And well, gee whiz, it turns out my life is ripe for contextualizing because you have the immigrant experience,
Right.
all these, and my whole history with my difficulties with the educational process, my becoming a child bohemian, my eventual ascension into the ranks of published writers,
Hmm.
all this learning stuff. But it was almost instantaneous, really. I didn't search for it. The template of the two intersecting timelines. It's not a suspense novel trick, and it builds interest. It's a mechanism, and it was a mechanism for me writing too. I've never written anything in my life the way I've written this book. It probably it's hard to estimate exactly, but it probably took me about 2 months. I was writing literally morning, noon, and night, which I never do, except maybe in the last two chapters of big books or something like that. It was crazy. I couldn't not be writing. Mostly it was a straight shot. I mean, I did very little backing and filling.
Hmm.
I was writing it as it came out, and maybe in the second pass I took out some words, but that's about it.
It's really kinetic. The energy is really kinetic in this book. For a memoir especially, it's wildly propulsive. which isn't necessarily, because obviously the nature of a memoir, right? And it's a writer, right? You're a writer writing about being a writer as a big chunk of this book. And, hi, welcome to my head.
Yeah.
Welcome to the interior of my brain. I'm going to lay everything out for you.
Exactly.
But I'm not at all surprised to hear that you wrote it really quickly. And also the structure, I mean, Greil Marcus years ago described you as a hard-boiled writer, right? Just stylistically. I mean, and the clip of your sentences, right? And just word choices and things like that. There's a little bit of a swing and there's a lot of slang that, I guess maybe it's sort of the 50s and the 60s, but you've sort of pulled back into Lucy Sante. I just think of it as you, right? And you on the page. But all of these pieces, it's like there's just such a clear through line between the criticism and the writing of the books and like even evidence, right? Like, which is a book I hadn't really thought about in a really long time until I was prepping for this interview. And all of the photographs that you combed through to create that book. Like, you've always been kind of a multimedia writer for me. Like, you were a little ahead of your time.
Well, I wanted to be, I wanted to be an artist, but I went to Columbia, but also I was colorblind.
I think I didn't know that.
I wanted to make music, but really I wanted to sing and I was too shy. And I wanted to be a filmmaker until I was Jim Jarmusch's roommate while he was in film school. And I realized that to be a film director, you have to be an army general. And I wasn't prepared to do that. I just don't have the personality type for that. So, the musician, the painter, and the filmmaker are all there in my head when I'm writing all the time,
And I know Patti Smith was she was one of the creatives who blew your mind early on. And you've written about this multiple times, but the idea that she is being Patti Smith, before she was Patti Smith.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about some of the women that you've sort of, I don't want to say modeled yourself on. It's not that, but you talk about how like these women who are trailblazers, right? Or they're alone in a way, right? Like sometimes you make sacrifices in one thing or another to excel in the thing that you really want to excel in. But it's kind of a great list. It runs from Eartha Kitt to Joan Didion to Jean Moreau to Mary Tyler Moore. And I'm smiling as I'm thinking about this list because it just is, I mean, you kind of are a woman of your era, but at the same time, like it runs the gamut. But you did also wrestle with the idea of who you were going to be as a woman, right? And so you're pulling all of these different ideas, which is like what teenagers do too. I mean, it makes perfect sense.
It's my mood board,
Okay, mood board. I like that. Mood board. But I want to talk about your mood board because you're pulling from the visual arts, you're pulling from film, you're pulling from writing in all of these different places. But you've been doing it all along, right? I mean, most of your friends were women for the longest time.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, pretty much. I mean, at least beginning in my mid-20s. Yeah. No, it's absolutely true.
And you know what? Elizabeth Hardwick is one of those. And I didn't realize you and Daryl Pinckney had known each other for forever and a day. And he's kind of fun to read, too. Is that how you met Elizabeth? Through Daryl?
Yes, exactly. And by the way, Daryl published a memoir last year, and I see our memoirs as really being like, matching parentheses or something like that. I mean, he's as much in my memoirs as I'm in his memoir, and we're very different people, but we're like very tight at the same time.
But you're both writers first.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, I meet a lot of folks who are, working on new projects or, want to be writers and that. And then the people I know who are working writers are just like, yeah, I do a thing. I'm going to go do my thing. And maybe I get something out of it. I mean, obviously you knew this particular piece was going to be a book, but I want to talk about some of the other ones too, because you do have a tendency to pick the unexpected, right? Like Low Life, I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to give this a whirl. What is this? And I could not put it down. And it's just this very weird history of weird bits of New York. And the narrative really holds.
And at the time, part of it is, well, really the case was Low Life and my Paris book especially. I wrote books that I would want to read.
Yeah, okay.
And, I remember like, this is a very sensitive period in New York's history when I sort of started engaging with that stuff. It was toward the late 80s. And I had an idea, like it was called in my mind A History of the Slums.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, somebody's written that for sure. But nobody had written it.
And then for the 10th anniversary, you write a new introduction, which I have read. And it's a little baggy, my friend. You are correct when you say it's a little baggy. And then Barbara Epstein at the New York Review says, yeah, I'll publish it, but you have to cut it.
By 2/3.
Yeah, okay, by 2/3, which it was a little baggy.
It was great. It set me free. I learned so much from that one exercise.
And that's part of how I feel like we got to the new book,
Mm-hmm.
because it is tighter than a lot of what you've written. Because even Factory of Facts, I mean, you're playing, and I'm really thinking about that opening where you're like, here are 19 different versions of how my life could have gone. Right. But this, I'm not sure we would have gotten to this exact book as we have it. I heard her call my name. Without that exercise of you being told, you've got to learn to pare it down.
And, you know, to be completely nerdish about this, I mean, the music that I was hearing in my head when I wrote Factory of Facts was a very poor choice on my part, because it was Speak Memory by Nabokov.
Oh.
Nobody should really ever be directly influenced by Nabokov. He's fabulous, but you have to be a white Russian born in the 19th century. It cannot be done otherwise. This book, though, this is an obscure reference, but it's a novel by Maurice Blanchot called The Madness of the Day, translated by Lydia Davis, came out in the early 90s. You know, it's like recognizing a melody. I've written this like song, and I know the melody, or the rhythm at least, something about it comes from this place, and it's that book. It's like a 65-page novella.
Okay, now I want to go hunt it down, because also I quite liked Lydia Davis's Madame Bovary translation, and Bovary is a novel that I have issues with. Okay, I have issues with Bovary, and I will totally admit that I have issues with that book. But I like Lydia Davis's translation. Like I just,
great translator.
Connected me, and obviously I'm not reading Bovary in the original French, but nonetheless, I would like to enjoy the thing that I'm reading, even if the subject matter is tricky, or even if, you know, I'm reading something that not everyone has a happy ending, whatever. I would like the sentences to be gorgeous. Can I please have beautiful sentences, which obviously I get with you. I mean, do you think this is setting a new tone for the work that's going to come? I mean, you reviewed Hua Shu's memoir, Stay True, which is a book I love. But I feel like I haven't seen your bylines so much recently, and I feel like that means you're cooking something new.
This year marks the year when I have retired from teaching, and also retired from freelancing to the extent that I can afford to do so now.
Okay.
I just want to write books, and I have, well, my next book is, as part of my 2-book contract. And then I have another book that I'm ready to leap into, and then a third book, which is a big mystery even to me. But that's the situation right now. You know, just before last year, 2022, I published my Reservoirs book. And that's the question I've gotten from interviewers is, how weird that you wrote a book about the New York reservoir system, and then you go to writing this gender transition memoir. How weird is that? And I pointed out that, well, I mean, there's a whole backstory to why and how and when I wrote that book. But the key fact is that I've written about everywhere I've lived. I have a strong sense of place. And I've been living up here for, a quarter of a century, and I'd never written about it.
Yeah, I actually didn't think it was weird. I just thought, oh, Lucy has an interest. Lucy's going to write a book. I mean, that's sort of how I've approached reading your work. It's just like, okay, I'll follow you. Because, yes, you're right. Story is maybe not the thing I think of first when I think. But the pleasure I get from your work comes from your approach. And sort of you have this sort of sly little bit of a nod, a little bit of a wink. Yeah, Grail Marcus and the hard-boiled piece too. But it is the cadence of the language, and it is absolutely your point of view where you're kind of like, well, is it art, or is it craziness, or is this humanity, or is it art? I feel like you're always circling this idea of what's art, what's performance. Like the way you talk about how you had to perform your life before you transitioned, you were like, I was always performing. But then again, it was like the early 70s in New York. Like, was anyone not performing? I mean,
Yeah.
please, I've seen the photos.
Yeah.
It's wild. It's
Sure.
completely wild, but absolutely place with you without a doubt. I mean, certainly New York and Paris, but also
Belgium.
home. Yeah, but home, like Belgium, but home as an idea and a concept, right?
Yeah.
Like that seems like something that was always that you were wrestling with. Your mom was really complicated.
Oh
Your
boy.
mom had a really rough go. Do you feel like you have peace with your parent? I mean, they're both obviously long dead at this point, but now that you've been able to write this book, do you feel like you have peace?
It's a kind of exorcism. It really is. Yeah. Because I mean, I stayed angry at my mother in particular for a long time after her death, even. I thought death would make the peace, but it didn't happen. But I think this may have done it.
I hope so. I mean, honestly, I just want to read the next book and the book after that and the book after that. Can we also talk about other influences? Because again, I've mentioned that you have run with artists and filmmakers and other writers for a long time. But in terms of the writing itself, it feels like there are a number of sort of, do I call it postmodern French novelists? I guess I do. But like Kathy Acker is also someone that you whose work you really loved for a long time.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
can we just sort of do a tour through your bookcases for a second
Oh my
and
God.
how we got to
No.
Lucy? I know
I've got a lot of
I'm
them.
actually trying to read the spines. This is just what we've done on the show
Mhm.
the past little bit. But in terms of how we got Lucy as a writer, like who were some of those? And obviously not Nabokov intentionally, but
Right. Oh boy. I mean, there's so many, right? I was a poet.
mm-hmm.
Lambeau blew my mind at the age of
Yeah.
13. And then the New York School of Poets, especially John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, Kenneth Koch, and then the second and third generations. And then working for the New York Review, that rather, well, it was a very interesting mix of radicalism and conservatism there.
Mm-hmm.
Very conservative in like literary table manners, but radical in substance. That very affected me very much. How to do a good job, basically, and which in an essayistic tradition goes back to like Macaulay or Hazlitt. And then all kinds of modern writing, all through the 20th and even taking many steps into the 21st century. In terms of memoirists, well, one person who yeah, I mean, discovered completely by accident, bookstore in Paris. I was buying a book to read on the plane, and that's how I started reading Emmanuel Carrère. He's made some incredibly foolish moves in his books, and I've chided him for it in print, but he's still a very, very interesting writer. I mean, I'm he's one of those memoirists where I'm not entirely sure how conscious he is of the effect his words will have. And also, for that matter, as you were talking before, I was remembering a detail in the book, which is it's a class I took with my girlfriend, her ex-boyfriend, my ex-girlfriend, and her new boyfriend. We were all in this class called Autobiography in the 19th Century.
Okay.
And it begins with, well, it begins before the 19th century with Augustine and then Rousseau, and then all these British guys from the 19th century, all British, all guys. And they're a remarkable bunch of books. And in fact, my working title for this one is I knew I was going to publish it under this title. My working title was Apologia Pro Vita Sua, Apology for One's Own Life, which is John Henry Cardinal Newman's memoir. There are echoing effects, even though that class occurred many, many, many years ago. And I'm not even sure I still own any of those books now, but they left their mark.
Yeah, occasionally I have to buy new copies of things when I'm prepping for a show because time and tiny New York apartments, things happen. And every now and again, it's kind of wild. I mean, one, the jacket treatments usually get at least a little better, if not different. But every now and again you have to go and stuff goes out of fashion and you just, it doesn't exist anymore, like, or it only exists as an E. And, fine. It's funny to think that something that was seminal at one point in your life, you're kind of like, I can't even find it. I have no idea. Like, I have no idea.
Well, in my
What
case, it was
happened to it?
because I was so happy to be out of school. I got rid of anything that was a textbook, or not everything, but most things. A little bit hubristic on my part.
Where do you think you go next? I mean, I know you've said you're going to write books now and freelancing and the teaching, and it frees up so much space. I mean, is the thing you're not talking about possibly a novel? I mean, you've talked about wanting to write fiction.
That may have something to do with my Project X.
Okay.
My next book, the second part of my contract, is a book about the Velvet Underground and their place in the New York of the 1960s, which is, I've always wanted to write about New York in the 1960s and all these worlds that intersected, that seem like a vast population, but may have only totaled a few hundred people. But also with New York's beyond this, art bohemia, et cetera,
Right.
world, there was just New York as it was then. And a place that I first excitedly experienced when I was very young, and then started going to high school and starting in 68. So that's the next book. And after that, I want to write a book about writing.
Yeah.
And then there's Project X.
Okay. We can be patient. We can be patient. I think it's the craft. I mean, certainly I'm waiting with bated breath for the New York book. That is the one that I'm just like, hello. But the craft book is a really good idea too, because you just have a really distinct style. And I really appreciate it. Like, it's that high-low thing in a single sentence. And it's really hard to do well. I mean, there are plenty of people who do the absolute, like, I will give you the perfect sentence kind of thing. And then there are people who are like, well, I'm going to give you the big feeling and the sentence is going to be really sloppy. And you're like, well, guess what? And I feel like everything you do has a wink and a nod to it. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's how it's always felt to me, where you're like, did you notice? Did you see what it's not like you're looking for approval. It's more like, if you get it, you get it. Right. And that's in all of your books. Right. And it's really here. It's really super present. And I heard her call my name because you're just like, okay, I'm giving you Belgium and I'm giving you New Jersey and I'm giving you Colombia and I'm giving you the girlfriend that moved to San Francisco. And I'm also giving you the pieces of myself that I've been doubting and questioning. And yet you can still, in a way, do it with a wink and a nod. I mean, you sent a letter on someone's birthday and you were like, I have no idea why I did that. And the reader was saying, oh, you did that. But you owned it.
Yeah.
You didn't leave anything out. And this is not a very long book.
Yeah.
This is like a third of the length of Little Life.
It's so short. I wanted the photographs to appear just like in the middle of the text, like Sebald. In fact, that's what really was thinking. My text was so short that to get it to a certain like required page count, they had to put many of them as full page blow-ups.
Well, I'm glad we hit the page count. I think the photos matter. I think in terms of the experience of reading your story and how you set it up, the photos really matter. But again, it's not the first time you've used photos in your work.
No.
They're beautiful. They're really beautiful.
Photos
and I think they're
are
really
in
important.
Almost all my book.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I knew this was going to happen and I knew we were going to bump up against time. And yes, time's a construct, whatever. But more importantly, you do have books to write. So before I let you go, though, I'm wondering if when you were writing, I heard her call my name. Were you writing solely for yourself, or were you thinking about readers when you were writing this book? Because it is so personal, and not just for the obvious reasons, but also, I mean, I've sort of alluded to it throughout this conversation, that there is a lot where you hold yourself accountable that maybe not everyone would, or at least not publicly in a book that anyone could read. So I'm just wondering how you sort of approach that, or if it's changed from book to book, even like how you think about your readership.
Well, that truthfulness is really an outcome of my writing process, because I'm constantly holding up every sentence and asking, is this the truth? Am I fronting? Am I grandstanding? Am I prevaricating? Am I leaving something out? every single sentence I write for any book or any article, whatever. The other thing is, no, I certainly wasn't writing strictly for myself. With any book, as I'm writing, I'm imagining a whole variety of people taking it in. I mean, that's my chorus of critics I keep in my head,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm imagining, various personality types, people I know, people I barely know but can imagine, etc. Furthermore, with this book, I mean, I was really writing it with the idea of speaking to people, especially, well, one thing since coming out is I haven't met very many trans people, but I've met a whole lot of parents of trans people,
Oh,
people my
interesting.
age who have children who are trans. And it's been great talking to them. But I'm also, I'm always hoping to really my ideal reader is the, 15-year-old version of myself. And I want to give them encouragement. And I want to tell their parents that, look at me. I mean, I knew at age 9. It
Yeah.
wasn't some will-o'-the-wisp that was going to fly away in a few years. And it wasn't influenced by media. It came from within. I'm talking through my hat here, but I actually think it's not a psychological phenomenon at all. I think it's a physiological phenomenon. But anyway, rabbit hole that way. Also, I want to make a point about, I didn't want to make it too much of a point because I didn't know how far the metaphor would really extend. But it seemed to me that there was an eerie resemblance between transitioning as transgender and the kind of transitioning I did as a kid being rapidly acculturated in America as an immigrant. There were similar kinds of education.
There's so much in this memoir. Lucy Sante, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. I heard her Call My Name is out now, and of course you can find all of Lucy's books on the shelves too. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Miwa. This was great.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.